Welcome to Coleman Report Live. I'm Bob Coleman. We're talking Main Street and the small business lenders who help it grow. Lance and Delaney are in the house. Welcome you too.
Good to be here.
Southern California, we're getting hit with a, they're hyping it. They're saying it's a hurricane. It's a rainstorm. It's a rainstorm. But we're probably getting rain. So, welcome all. You know the certificates of participation. Joseph, that's the wrong certificate of participation. That's for Lance's loan training class.
Yeah.
But take the loan training and that's what you get. So anyway. Hey, we want to ask some poll questions about liquidation. We got very good fraud stories, but let's start with this first. Do you have a servicing or liquidation officer at the Fresno or Little Rock SBA centers that you are able to talk to periodically?
Now this is, it's a great question because every lending institution needs somebody at the centers they talk to. It's been more difficult lately because the servicing centers, it does go to a central phone line. You need to have their extension to be able to talk to them. But
Lance, how do you, I agree with you, Lance. It's nice to form that type of relationship. What do you recommend?
Well, I think that if you have the ability to for instance, if you're close enough, take a group of your SBA lenders to Fresno or the Little Rock Center and just call ahead and see if you can arrange a visit to get to know them. But your servicing activity and your liquidation activity always goes better when you have a person that you can talk to at one of the centers. Also,
that goes with Herndon.
Yes.
That's great advice. I cannot encourage you more to do that. Send them. They will open up with red carpet. They'll take you to the tours. They'll treat you like royalty, and because they like to show up what they do.
Well,
encourage that. Maybe what you do is maybe get together with a couple other, gather your staff and go up there. Highly recommend that, Lance.
Yeah, but I would call it ahead. SBA, SBA is still working on, I was talking to an SBA official and he indicated that they're teleworking all but 2 days of pay period. So you probably want to check and kind of get advance notice that you're coming so you make sure you show up on a day when people are there.
Yeah, or plan on doing something in 2023. I mean,
yeah.
And if you need help setting that up, Lance and I would be more than happy to make introductions.
Oh, yeah.
Be happy to do that. Number two, does SBA have the authority to levy civil fines against SBA lenders?
Well, and everything over the last 2 or 3 years, SBA's had enhanced enforcement abilities, and it does include the ability to levy fines.
Absolutely. And the limit on that, it's in the SOP. I'm going to say, I think it's a $250,000 limit, but that's not what you have to worry about. The problem is when lenders have settled, they don't settle with the SBA, they settle with the Department of Justice. They write them a check and don't admit wrongdoing. But there have been some large fines levied in the last several years against lenders for eligibility issues, for making loans to franchises that were ineligible, and for repeated violations. You're not going to get fined for a one-off, but if you have a systemic issue, you're not going to be talking to SBA, you're going to be talking to Department of Justice.
Yep.
Number three, how many SBA loans does your institution have that have been in liquidation for more than 24 months? We haven't asked this question in a while, Lance.
Well, and I suspect the number is fairly low, but it's something that we need to think about. SBA has very definite rules on wrapping up your loans and recommending charge-off. And those numbers are not surprising to me, Bob, because we've had a couple of years of very low delinquency in SBA portfolios, but I think the delinquencies are rising. And again, understanding the wrap-up requirements are very important.
And Lance, what would you recommend? I know you're going to be talking about this in your webinar next week, but once something hits 25 months, I assume there's an action the lender should take other than
Well, you can get the wrap-up period extended if there are extenuating circumstances, but you know, in most, probably 99% of cases, you can get it wrapped up in 24
What is
months.
the liability to the lender if they do not do anything and you're looking at 30 months, 36 months, 48 months?
Well, I think if you have, it's just like everything with SBA. When we're talking about fines, if you make one mistake, they're not going to fine you. And the same thing with wrap-ups. If you have an individual wrap-up that goes over the period, SBA is not going to get overly excited. But if you have a continuing history of letting loans go beyond the 24-month period, then you get referred to Okram, and that can impact several areas. Yeah, no.
And so pay attention. The reason why this is important is because Congress is pushing the agency with the overriding question every time is, hey, how do we know we're guaranteeing loans for people who need it? They can't get credit elsewhere. And two, how do we know that our partners, the banks, are doing the program correctly? So
Yes.
SBA hammered with those two questions at every hearing. So this is why this is important. SBA then says, well, we have 63% of the industry is compliant, 33% is not, and they're going to say, well, what's going on with the 33%? That's why you get 24 months is a pretty strict deadline.
Yeah, I think it's just a reminder, when you have an SBA loan, you submit for guarantee purchase, you get paid on the guarantee, you charge it off your books, but it's not finished until you wrap it up with SBA and recommend the charge off to them.
Very good. Hey, Lance did a great job last August on PPP updates, and we have a quick poll question. If he repeats that, is that something that there's some new information you need? And Lance, the format of that was primarily a Q&A. I mean, you give an update of everything that's going on, but how many questions did you pull? Over 30.
We had more than 20 questions in the format of the training. Before you select an answer, the format of the training is some information, but it's mostly a lot of question and answer.
Well, very good. Well, 10%. That's a huge number. So okay.
Yeah.
We're going to do it. We'll do it. We'll do it for you. For your 91% ignore everything. That's fun. Delaney, what's going on with Fraud Friday? You're sitting there patiently waiting to speak.
Well, I found a couple. I'm not going to say good. I found a couple interesting stories. Starting here with Kenneth. Kenneth managed to get about $2.5 million between PPP EIDL and from his job at an archdiocese. So he applied for $2.7 million in PPP loans for 9 different companies and managed to obtain $2.1 million. And he used this money partially to help buy some interesting, not business-related expenses, including a $300,000 yacht, an over $1 million row house, nearly $50,000 sports sedan, all of which was either seized as soon as possible or they did a civil forfeiture complaint to make sure that none of this could be sold before this guilty plea. He ultimately got 6.5 years, I believe.
What was his position at the archdiocese? Do we know?
He was the assistant superintendent. So he was writing invoices for different expenses such as crisis intervention programs, anti-bullying programs, and instead these checks were going to his bank accounts.
Well, I think based on what his position is, Lance, he got a little at the higher end of the spectrum, just as when bankers show up and they do malfeasance, they definitely have a target on their back.
Yeah, I was a little concerned about the brand of yacht he bought, ill-gotten. I'm just teasing. I've not heard of it. But, SBA opened up SBA lending to religious organizations, and you'd have to believe as a lender that that would be a very safe, fraud-free environment. But from Mr. Gahan, I think I pronounced that right, he obviously, shows us that there is the potential for fraud, irregardless of the business type.
Trust but verified. Trust but verified.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's unfortunately put a black mark on everything. The Archdiocese, whoever, obviously they're doing good work in terms of the other programs, but you do something like this and that gets shoved aside. And 6 years sounds appropriate. Was it $2.5 million, Delaney, that he got?
Yes, I believe it was 2.1 million from the COVID programs, and then 438,000 from his job.
Good. We're going to call the next person Don or Jean. We're not even going to try to pronounce his name, but Delaney, what did Jean do?
Oh.
Yes. There was a series of very interesting fraud schemes going on here, starting off with this man worked with computer hackers who got into bank accounts of people across the country and did wire transfers into accounts owned by, what was the name we're giving them?
Don. Call him Don.
Don? Okay. Sending them to his bank accounts in a second fraud scheme. He was working with pharmacies across the country as well to do Medicare and Medicaid fraud. A lot of this was surrounding billing with HIV medications that were never dispensed or obtained. And then finally, of course, we've come to our COVID relief fraud, because that seems to go along with most other types of fraud. He laundered proceeds for loans and grants into his personal accounts as well.
If you have a company that 100% of the revenues are derived from Medicare, it's a red flag. Doesn't mean don't do the loan. It just means it's a red flag. How do they get their money? They simply sit down on the computer and they type in Lance Sexton, got medical procedure 1637, and we get $127 for that. Bam. And that's it. And they get paid. They get paid once a month or whenever it is. They simply put in what they have. In other words, they don't submit a bill to the government pays us, so they can draw directly from the government piggyback. And that's why you see a lot of these Medicare frauds that they put in numbers. And again, one-offs, they're not going to go after you. But where, as Delaney said, here you had a specific HIV medicine, and they went after him, and you hear stories of ophthalmologists and their cataract surgeries, and they do one every 7 minutes. So make sure when you're dealing with these companies that the character is the first C issue. I mean, all your small business people can engage in type of fraud, but this type of fraud can be done very, very easily. Lance, I don't know, have you worked with a company?
I have not worked with a company that relied on Medicare reimbursement or Medicaid reimbursement, but there was a company here locally, a news story let off, and it showed the police officers going to this gigantic house and multiple beautiful cars out front, and they were arresting the guy. And I immediately thought it was PPP fraud, but apparently this individual, I don't know how the COVID tests that the government paid for were reimbursed, but this guy was doing astronomical numbers of COVID tests and getting reimbursed, and had a very lavish lifestyle.
Yeah, we're not saying don't loan to these companies. We're saying just
make sure they have great character.
Yeah, be careful, because that's it's the government ATM card, and they can withdraw it whenever they want. And finally, we're going to call the next person Jan. What did Jan do?
Yes, Ms. Janola also committed fraud. Now, I want to give her the tiniest bit of credit, because it seems that she did actually use part of her loans for her business, which is Jane. What is it? So she had a business as a, like essentially a beauty school, and she received Jane Elizabeth Education Group. Sorry, I couldn't get there. A beauty career training company, to which she got about $700,000, I believe. And while some of that was used for the business, on the loan authorization and agreement, she certified that she was not going to use this for any loans, gifts, bonuses, or any of the sort to somebody else, of which she did. About $50,000 was transferred to friends and family, $83,000 funded personal investment and retirement accounts, and she personally withdrew $30,000 in cash.
So how much, so she used, it looks like she took about a third of the money for her personal use. Is that what we're saying?
Yes, that's accurate.
What was her penalty? She pled guilty. Do we know what her sentence is?
She pled guilty recently, but we don't know a sentence yet.
Okay. Again, I've mixed emotions on these. If they're guilty, they need to do it. This is different reporting than was 10 years ago when every Friday we talked about community bankers that were being indicted. So here they're going after the borrowers, and they're not allowing the borrowers to turn state evidence against the bankers. But still, my attitude is if it's root it all out and let's get the money back.
Oh, absolutely. But there's a big discussion in PPP fraud because in 2021, of course, it was independent contractors, sole proprietors, Schedule C filers. Well, typically there's one employee, and the PPP funds are supposed to pay that employee. So I had this discussion with a borrower the other day. He was all worried about submitting for forgiveness, and I'm like, did you write a check to yourself from your company to pay yourself? And he said, yeah. I said, you're fine. That's payroll.
Yeah.
How you spend it after you write that check to yourself is up to you.
Yes. And Lance, you see didn't name a name. So how much for the one sole proprietor? How much was the loan? 50 grand?
Oh, it was like $18,000.
Yeah. So these are small amounts also, and that passes the test. 18,000. Okay, that seems reasonable.
But Bob, what happens is this gentleman had read online of numerous PPP fraud stories, and he was all wound up about using the money on personal expenses. But in reality, in 2021, a huge percentage of the loans were to, individual business owners and contractors who payroll was paying themselves. And the great distinction is if they write a company check to themselves, put it in their account, how they spend it's up to them.
Well, Lady's not reporting on any stories where the person's pled guilty because they spent $200 on the electric bill and they went to
Costco. But those are coming.
Those are coming. All right, but those are allowable reimbursements.
Yeah,
that's. Well, very good. Delaney, thank you very much. Lance, thank you. Everyone enjoy the weekend, and thank you all for joining us today for Coleman Report Live and for supporting America's Main Street, one entrepreneur at a time.
Have a great week.
Thank you for joining us today for today's episode. If you like today's content, hit that subscribe button to subscribe to our channel, and click that bell icon to get notified about our latest videos. Thank you again for joining us today and for supporting America's Main Street, one entrepreneur at a time. Catch you next time.